Hello everyone and welcome to today's Cambridge University Press ELT webinar. I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Dennis Johnson as today's presenter. Dennis had his first language teaching experience as a Peace Corps volunteer in South Korea. Following that teaching experience, he became an in-country ESL trainer. After returning to the United States, he became an ESL trainer at the City College of San Francisco, where he taught all levels of ESL from 1977 until his recent retirement, and served indeed for many years as the ESL site coordinator there. He's a co-author of the Ventures series and the demonstration teacher on the Ventures Professional Development DVD. So, over to you, Dennis.
Thank you, Alistair. Welcome. I'm Dennis Johnson, one of the 5 authors of the Ventures series, and I'm very happy to be presenting on the topic of advanced level collaborative activities. It's exciting to realize that even though I'm talking to you from my home in Northern California, many of you participating today are from different countries around the world. This feels very special. Many thanks to everyone at Cambridge University Press for their help in facilitating this webinar. Here is our agenda today. First, we're going to talk about why collaborative activities are important. We're going to look at different types of collaborative activities. We're going to talk about issues related to setup, grouping, modeling, and closure. And then we'll identify an online source for collaborative activities. And hopefully at the end there'll be plenty of time for your questions. Since we're talking about collaborative activities today, we need to be clear on what we mean by collaboration. It means that students work together in pairs, small groups, or as a whole class, and it means that students need to interact to accomplish a task. This statement is very strong. Cooperative learning has a dramatic positive impact on almost all of the variables critical to language acquisition. Kagan made this statement 20 years ago, but it's still true. Notice that he doesn't say that he's talking about only lower level learners. One of our goals as teachers is to help our students become fluent in English. And Paul Nation says something amazing about fluency. Before we own a word, we need multiple exposures. For recognition, around 20 times. For production, nearly 60 times. To provide that exposure to their students, teachers need a variety of activities. The point seems to be that students need lots of time to practice their new language, and collaborative activities can be a big help. Today there's a lot of talk about career readiness. A big part of career readiness is the development of what are called soft skills. Most of the things on this list are soft skills. I have starred the ones that especially apply to our discussion today. These 7 C's come from the 21st Century Learning Framework, where employers and government and educational institutions help learners prepare for work and become successful in the 21st century workplace. Notice that 4 of these 7 skills are used when students are engaged in collaborative work. Number 2 and number 3 are obvious, but number 1, critical thinking and problem-solving skills, are part of collaboration, as we will see today. And number 5, cross-cultural understanding can be the end result when students from different cultures work side by side. College and career readiness standards are increasingly important in many parts of the United States. The emphasis here is making sure that students are being given the tools to move on to opportunities for higher education and work. The college and career readiness standards are broken down into different areas, such as reading, writing, speaking and listening, and something called language, which is grammar. And there are what's called anchor standards for each different area. Here are examples of some of those anchor standards. Participate in a range of conversations and collaborations. There's that collaboration word. Ask questions to check understanding and clear up confusion. Here we're talking about clarifying meaning. Present information so that listeners can follow the line of reasoning. Talking about using evidence. And demonstrate command of the conventions of standard English, which is all about using correct grammar. The reason I'm bringing this up is so that you can see how well collaborative activities go hand in hand with addressing these standards. Today's workshop focuses on collaborative activities for advanced ESL learners, but I'm convinced that collaborative activities are important at every level. Proficiency requires the ability to use all four modalities: listening, speaking, reading, and writing. Maybe we have the idea that advanced students need to focus more on their reading and writing skills. But the skills of listening and speaking still need to be practiced because all four skills go hand in hand. Any group of learners, as you know, includes different learning styles. Collaborative activities appeal to at least 3 different types of learning styles. Interpersonal, those who are good with others. Verbal, those who benefit from expressing themselves orally, the talkers. Kinesthetic, those who benefit from moving around, as occurs with conversation cards, as we will see. Remember that standard about checking understanding in the last slide? Communication often involves negotiating. When we don't understand others, we need to ask questions to clarify. And when others don't understand us, we need to restate or explain. Collaborative activities create a situation that frequently requires this kind of negotiating. And this skill is so important in the real world. And finally, our job is to help move students to fluency. Collaboratives give students multiple opportunities to practice their new language. I think you're getting the point that I think collaborative activities are very important. But I want to share a little about my own experience. First, as a classroom teacher in San Francisco, I have seen the value of these activities with my students. I have seen how students come awake when they had the opportunity to work together. I have read their evaluations at the end of the semester when they thank me for the opportunities to practice the language over and over in class. As I became involved as one of the 5 authors of the Ventures team, I had more and more exposure to different ideas for student collaboration. And I kept bringing these ideas into my own teaching with good results. Over time, I realized that I wanted every lesson to move to a practice stage that included some pair work or small group work or whole class collaboration. And very recently, I have helped to work on creating collaborative activities for our advanced level textbook transitions. There are a total of 40 new activities, including 30 collaborative activities and 10 projects. All these materials are now online and free for you to download. And so I'm excited about sharing some of them with you. Later in the presentation, I'll show you how you can access these materials on the Ventures Online Teachers Resource Room. Okay, it's time to begin. The first activity I want to talk to you about is the student interview. And I'm actually going to show you 2 different kinds of interviews. The first one is based on responses to a listening passage. This is the worksheet that goes with the activity. Don't worry if it's hard to read. Later we'll zoom in. Students work in pairs to ask and answer 7 questions about an oral lecture that is part of the opening lesson in each unit in transitions. Notice there are 2 columns on the worksheet, one with the questions and one column with the space for students to take notes on the answers. There are 2 kinds of questions. The first 5 are questions that require citing evidence from the lecture, and the last 2 are questions that require supporting an opinion. Here is a summary of the key elements of this activity. As you saw on the last slide, there is a worksheet with questions. The worksheet is based on the listening passage in the student book. Partners work together to ask and answer questions. Students take notes on their partner's answers. Students write sentences using academic language phrases for citing evidence and supporting opinion. Let's listen to about 1 minute of the listening passage here so that you will get the sense of what precedes the interview. This is from Transitions Unit 6, Lesson A, and this clip can also be found on the Ventures Arcade website as an MP3 file. Let's listen.
Unit 6, page 53, Exercise 2, Listening.
I'd like to spend some time today talking about small talk. Now, I know this is a subject that many of you are very interested in because the rules of conversation are quite different in your home cultures. Students are always asking me, what is small talk? When and why? And which topics are okay to talk about? So let me start by giving some general answers to those questions. So, first of all, what is small talk? Well, it's a kind of casual or light conversation about neutral or non-controversial subjects like the weather or sports. It's the kind of conversation we have with people in places like parties, or standing in line somewhere, or when we're waiting for a class or a business meeting to start.
I think you get a sense of that. Here's a close-up of the first 3 questions. You can see that they require the person answering to cite evidence. So the question is not just what is small talk, but how does the speaker define small talk? Similarly, for question 2, the question is not just when might small talk take place, but according to the speaker, what are some occasions when small talk might take place? Notice that some words are underlined. We are encouraging our students to become familiar with academic language, and we'll say more about that in just a minute. Here is a close-up of the last 2 questions. These are personal opinion questions. However, the listener is asked to support his or her opinions with reasons. There can't just be a simple yes, no, or one-word answer. We're asking the student to do some critical thinking. Again, notice that some words are underlined. We're asking our students to become familiar with academic language. And speaking of academic language, I want to say something more about it. As we prepare students to succeed in an academic setting, we give them opportunities to hear and to use academic language that they will encounter in the course of their higher education. Here's a picture of students in Donna Price's classroom discussing a reading. Donna is one of the authors of Ventures. You can see the poster that's on the wall that lists phrases to cite evidence. Students can use these expressions when collaborating. Once their students are in groups, Donna has them review the academic language phrases before beginning to state their points of view. It's important for students to realize that there are informal ways of talking and there are more academic ways of talking. Remember that the last 2 questions on the interview were personal opinion questions. The answers to the questions aren't necessarily found in the text. To express an opinion, we can use expressions such as I think or I don't think. But to be more aligned with college readiness standards, we can teach academic English phrases. For example, students can give their opinions by saying, in my opinion, or based on my experience, or from my perspective, and so on. Well, we just took a little detour related to academic language. Let's get back to our worksheet. Here's the final activity that follows the interview. Here we give students the opportunity to use that academic language in their writing. The interview we just looked at was an interview with a partner. Here's an interview that involves a larger group of students. It comes as part of a lesson in Venture's Book 4 that talks about generational differences and thoughts about child rearing. Students sit together and go through the interview item by item, asking the questions and tallying how many in their group answer yes and how many answer no. Of course, one fun thing about interviews is that these types of questions lend themselves to further conversation. For example, look at question number 5. Can you tell me if you would permit your child to stay out late? If a student answers yes, it would be natural to ask a follow-up question. Really? How late would be okay? Would your child have to be supervised? And so on. If the answer is no, it would be natural to ask, why not? These kinds of casual and unscripted conversations are valuable for enabling students to become more fluent and spontaneous. An interesting feature of this particular interview is that following the interview, students work together to create a bar graph. The graph shows clearly how many yes answers there were to each question on the interview. This kind of work helps to promote numerical or mathematical literacy. It also provides a very clear snapshot in areas where there is agreement within the group. I have to tell you that conversation cards is one of my favorite collaborative activities. I think one of the reasons is that it asks students in the class to get on their feet, and it really picks up the energy in the room. In fact, sometimes it's hard to get students to stop talking with each other, which to me is actually a happy problem. Here's what the activity looks like. Later we'll zoom into some of the questions on the cards, but you can see that there are 12 cards separated by dotted lines. Note, if you can see it, the scissors icon to the left of the first card, which tells the teacher that these cards are meant to be cut apart. The conversation cards can be used in different ways. In trends, they provide additional practice with the grammar presented in the student book. The teacher hands out one card to each student in the class, and this means that if you have more than 12 students in a class, you'll need to duplicate this page enough times to ensure that each student will have a card. As I mentioned, this activity is a mingle activity where students are on their feet, circulating around the room, talking to as many different people as possible. Look at letter B at the top. It says, find a classmate, ask your question. Your classmate answers using the past perfect. Next, listen to and answer your classmate's questions. Then, exchange cards. This is very important. And letter C says, find another classmate and repeat. So students are always exchanging cards and moving on to new partners. Here is a close-up of some of the questions. Let's look at the first one. Anne had a great job interview for a position at a computer company. What do you think she had done before she went for the interview? Note that the grammar point is past perfect. What had she done? Students can answer by saying something like, I think she had prepared really well, or I think she had gotten a good night's sleep. All of these questions contain the targeted grammar point. Here is a slightly different activity using conversation cards. You'll see that the instructions are different. Here, instead of a question, the card gives a situation. And students must respond to the situation by using a particular grammar point. In this case, a past modal with could have or should have. This comes from Unit 5 in transitions where the grammar point is past modals. For example, the situation on the first card reads, I forgot to set my alarm clock, so I was late for a morning meeting. A student might respond, if you had set your alarm clock, you wouldn't have been late. Or if you hadn't been late for the meeting, you would have made a better impression. Like that. Again, after both partners have a chance to read their cards and respond, they exchange cards and move on to different partners. Here you see a summary of the key elements for the conversation card activity. There are 12 conversation cards. The cards are based on the grammar presented in the student book. Students mingle to ask and answer questions. After asking and answering, students exchange cards and move on. It turns out that some questions are about the unit topic and some are more general. I want to give you a little tip about making your own conversation cards. Many times I find that I want to make conversation cards that relate to a particular lesson that I'm teaching. Fortunately, it's very easy using the tables feature of Microsoft Word, which I'm most familiar with. After you open a new Word document, click on the Insert tab, then click on Table, and this pop-up window appears, allowing you to select how many rows and how many columns you want in your table. In the examples you just saw, the table had 3 columns and 4 rows, but maybe you want a table with 4 columns and 4 rows, whatever. After you select the size of your table, just type your questions in each cell, and then later you can drag the borders to make the table as large as you want. Then you can save and print. It's really very quick and easy. A jigsaw reading is a collaborative activity where students help each other to build comprehension of a reading passage. You've heard of jigsaw puzzles. Well, a jigsaw reading is an activity where different students have different pieces of the reading and they work together to put the whole thing together. Here is what the activity looks like in transitions. These jigsaws have 3 pieces to the puzzle. That is 3 different paragraphs here, and the paragraphs are cut apart on the dotted lines. This means that 3 students will be working together. Each person in the group is responsible for the content of one of the 3 paragraphs. This means that I can read what's on my portion of the jigsaw, but I don't see what my 2 classmates are reading. I'll have to rely on them to explain to me what they have read later. The 3 pieces of this jigsaw reading focus on the topic of hidden jobs. I want to just read a portion of the first reading. The heading is the 20-20-60 rule. Most job seekers spend the majority of their search time reviewing job postings and preparing for the job interview. The problem with this approach is that job seekers who rely on job postings miss out on applying for hidden jobs, jobs that never get advertised. Some estimate as much as 80% of job vacancies fall into the hidden job category. I'll stop there. This is the second page of the activity. The jigsaw involves 4 steps. First, students sit silently and read their respective paragraphs. After reading, they each answer guided questions like you see on this second page, and they make notes on key information in their particular paragraphs. So up to now, the students have all been working independently. Next, one at a time, students share with each other and take notes on what their classmates are telling them. The point is that students must become really clear on the information in their own paragraph before attempting to share this information with their classmates. Notice that the jigsaw reading is not a dictation. The skill here is reading for meaning and comprehension and being able to get the main points and summarize. The final activity at the bottom of the second page involves a discussion question related to the topic that all 3 students discussed together. And here you see a summary of key elements for a jigsaw reading. It's based on the extended reading that goes with the unit and is on the online teacher's resource room. The jigsaw consists of 3 one-paragraph readings. Students work in groups of 3, each becoming the expert. Students share information from their paragraph with others in the group, and then students discuss questions related to the topic by sharing and supporting their opinions or applying to new situations. Just like with the conversation cards, there are times when you'll want to create your own jigsaw. You can take a reading and divide it into sections which will be cut apart. You'll need to develop some focus questions to go along with each section of the jigsaw. And then you may want to come up with a final question that helps students to focus on something related to what they have just read. This next activity is called Unscramble. Just so you know, we're not talking about scrambled eggs here. We're talking about scrambled sentences which must be put back in order. Again, you see those dotted lines, which means that these sentence strips are to be cut apart. This is a scrambled reading. When I do this activity, I cut up the strips and place them in an envelope. One envelope with a complete set of strips for each group of 2 or 3 students. With a paper cutter, this step actually doesn't take very long. An alternative would be to have the students cut up the strips themselves, but then it's very important that the students mix up their strips and lay them out in front of them in scrambled order. They work in groups of 2 or 3, as I said. Then they work to arrange all the strips in a logical order. There are at least 2 ways to do this, with audio or without audio. Without audio, the exercise is quite challenging. Students have to pay special attention to cues which help them put the sentences in order. I have circled some of these cues, as you can see on the slide. For example, a sentence might use the pronoun he or she or they. Obviously, these pronouns would have to follow other sentences that give the antecedent of the pronoun. The other way to do this unscramble activity is for students to listen to an audio recording and arrange the sentence strips in order as they listen. And a hybrid way would be for students to first arrange the strips just by reading them, and then to use the audio to check their work and make changes. Here are the key elements for Unscramble. The activity is based on the reading passage in the student book. Students work in pairs or small groups, putting scrambled sentence strips in the correct order. May make use of the audio during the activity or as a final check. And students must be aware of word cues to be successful. We often think of dictations as being appropriate for lower level learners, but I found that they're valuable at every level. Dictations help to practice several skills at the same time: listening, speaking, reading, and writing. They also help to reinforce language and grammar points, unit vocabulary, spelling, and punctuation rules. The partner dictation involves two students with different worksheets. Here is the worksheet for student A. You can see that student A has a paragraph for part A, dog walking at the Humane Society, but only blank lines for part B, which is about volunteering at the library. Just so you know, this dictation comes from Transitions Unit 5, which talks about opportunities for volunteering. Here is the worksheet for student B. You can see that this worksheet is different because this student has blank lines for part A and a complete paragraph for part B. Look at the directions. For the first part, it says, listen to student A, write the paragraph. For the second part, it says, read the paragraph to student A. Student A will write the paragraph. Let's take a closer look at the content of this dictation. I want to read a little bit of it. Isabella enjoys volunteering. She loves animals, so she decided to volunteer at the local Humane Society. First, she had to take a general class to learn about becoming a volunteer. Then she took a dog handling class. In this class, Isabella learned how to tell which dogs had been walked and which needed to be walked, and so on. Remember that one of the useful things about collaboration is the need for clarification. I can see the person listening to this paragraph asking for help, spelling Isabella's name, or asking the reader to repeat or clarify certain words or phrases like dog handling. Note part C. Students check their work together. And the final activity is part D, where students discuss a question directly related to the two paragraphs. Which volunteering job is more interesting for you? Working at the Humane Society or the library, and why? Then the students talk about other volunteering jobs that they would like to do. Here's a summary of the key elements for the partner dictation. The topic relates to the unit being studied. It reinforces unit vocabulary. Students work with a partner, each dictating a paragraph. Students check their work by looking at each other's papers. And the culminating activity is a series of questions the students discuss orally. The partner dictation is another activity that would be easy to create with whatever materials you are using with your students. Okay, there are two more collaborative activities I want to show you. Activity 6 is role-playing. This activity gives students guidance as they think about the roles they are to play. They have a chance to formulate questions or answers in a thoughtful way before actually doing the role play. Here is student A's paper. You'll see in part A that there are some questions about Quan and an illustration picturing Quan reading a newspaper that has some information in it. In part B, we read that you are Quan, and you are going to ask questions of Sandra Tyler. And in part C, there are some guided questions that you're going to write down before you speak to Sandra Tyler. Here is student B's paper, and note how it's different from student A's paper. Even though the format is the same, the information here is all different. Remember, student A was Kwan. Now student B is Sandra, and she finds out that a man named Kwan is going to call her to learn about programs at the school. Here are the key elements for the role play. The topic and vocabulary relate to the unit. Students work with a partner. Each student has a different role in a situation that includes visual cues. Students have time to think about and write down some things that they will say to their partner. And then finally, students have a conversation according to the roles they are assigned. Perhaps as a culminating activity, a pair of volunteers could do their role play in front of the whole class, and the class could discuss the issues that come up. The last activity I want to talk about is share information, which is also called an information gap activity. Again, students work with a partner. Information gap means that each student has some information the student does not have. Students have to communicate to obtain the information that they are lacking. For example, let's say we each have an incomplete recipe with a list of ingredients. I have some of the ingredients listed on my recipe card, but other ingredients are missing. You know about my missing ingredients, but you don't have some of the ingredients that are on my recipe card. Together, and without looking at each other's paper, we will put together the complete recipe. Well, this particular activity that fits with Unit 2 in Venture's Book 4 is not about a recipe, but about programs offered at a community college and the schedule of classes. Let's focus on the first class, if you can see it, which is course DAC 602, a dental assisting class. You can see that student A has some of this information blank, such as the requirements and the location. Now let's look at the information on student B's paper. You'll see that student B has different information filled in and different information that's blank. Student B can speak about the requirements and the location of the class, but needs information about the days that the class is offered. In this share information activity, there will always be a guided conversation at the top, which reminds students of the language that they will need to complete the exercise. Let's look at the opening dialogue in section A. This happens to be a unit related to school and the different programs offered at community colleges. The grammar in this unit includes the passive voice in the present tense. Practicing expressions such as the class is offered in fall semester, and internships can be arranged for students. Help students to use this grammar in a real-life setting. Here you see a summary of the key elements for share information. Students work with a partner. Each person has some information that the other lacks. Students must ask each other about the missing information. Students write in the missing information on their papers, and then students check their papers together to see if the information they have filled in is accurate. Well, we have looked at 7 different collaborative activities. And now it's time to talk about some general issues that the teacher must deal with when asking students to work collaboratively. First, a word about grouping students. There are different ways to do this. One way is for the teacher to assign students to groups. This can be spontaneous or planned out in advance. Another way is to let students group themselves. Of course, one likely result is that students are going to sit next to the same friends every time. When possible, the teacher might ask students to sit next to someone who speaks a different first language. Also, the teacher may pass out cards with different numbers or colors. For instance, all the people with number 3 sit together, or all of the people with yellow cards sit together, etc. One fun technique for grouping students that I have used is to randomly pass out parts of picture postcards that I have cut in half. I'm a great collector of picture postcards. At least people used to send picture postcards. Students walk around, and when they find a match that completes their picture, they sit together. Later, I go around and collect the postcard pieces so that I can use them again. Let's say something about setting up your room. Where two students have different papers, sometimes it's important that students not see their partner's paper. If possible, you can tell the students to sit face to face, or perhaps put a file folder between them, or some kind of barrier. Obviously, it's very nice to have a room where desks can easily be moved and where there's plenty of room to move around. To some extent, this may be out of your control, but if the teacher has the expectation that there will be frequent group work, it's likely that the room arrangement can be optimized for this purpose. Over the years, my own classroom in San Francisco evolved from a traditional classroom with all desks facing the front to a horseshoe arrangement with students sitting in a big U. And that really helped to facilitate group work, and it helped to remind students that they can learn from each other. In cases where the desks are fixed, some students can be asked to turn their chairs around so that they can easily work with people sitting behind them. Modeling is very important, and I confess that I've sometimes had to learn this the hard way. It's so important to take the time at the beginning of a collaborative activity to model what it is the students will be doing. This is especially true of something like an information gap activity where it may not be obvious to students that they need to get missing information from their partner. Even though the modeling step takes time, I found that it's much better to be careful at the beginning than to jump into the activity and watch it crash and burn when students become confused about what they're supposed to be doing. As you do these collaborative activities again and again, the modeling step will take less time because students remember the different routines. I have learned, and again, I confess that I've learned the hard way, that there is an art to bringing a collaborative activity to a close. Imagine an activity that ends very abruptly. Maybe the teacher calls out, "Okay, class, please stop. Our time is up. See you tomorrow." Or imagine a different situation where the teacher brings the class back together and briefly highlights something related to the activity that has just ended. Perhaps the teacher says something like, "Let's talk for a minute about the question about networking at the bottom of the jigsaw. What were some of the answers you got to that interesting question?" This may seem like a small thing, but it helps with team building when everyone is focused on the same question. And it also makes students feel that they are accountable for the material they have just practiced. All of the activities I've showed you today can be found on the Ventures online teachers resource room. And I want to make sure you know how to search for and download materials from this site. Alistair, can you cue that recording? Here is our Ventures homepage, and you will see in the top right that you have two options. One is sign in and one is register. If you're a new user, you'll want to register by putting in your email, creating a password. They're going to ask you some questions about your school and so on. Since I'm a frequent user, I'm just going to sign in. My computer remembers my password. And now I'm in the teacher's resource room. You'll notice in the middle that there are 60 pages worth of materials here, so it's pretty daunting. You're going to have to narrow your search, and it says refine results. If you look on the left sidebar, you can narrow your search by level, by unit, by lesson. And if you look all the way at the bottom, there are resource types including collaborative activities. So let's click on collaborative activities right now. This narrows our search, and I'm going to refine by level. I'm going to click on transitions. And you will see here that there are several titles that come up. The very first title I wanted to point out is Collaborative Activities, Transitions, Worksheets, All. In other words, this is the entire set of collaboratives for transitions, which would be a handy file to download and save. You could also select by unit. But let's actually try downloading this file right now. And there it is. And this includes collaborative activities, the ones that I just talked about in this webinar. And this will be a valuable resource for you to have. And you can right-click and save this file, and then, of course, print it as you need it. On that clip, I just showed you how to download materials for the transitions level, but when you're checking out the site, look at the collaboratives for all the different levels, such as Ventures Book 4. The Ventures homepage is a very good web address to bookmark. And now I think it's time for some of your questions, so over to you, Alistair.
Thank you very much, Dennis. So we've got a few questions in already, and everyone make sure that if you type your questions into the chat now, we'll answer as many of these as we possibly can during the next 12 minutes or so. So we've got a question that Mary Louise has already started answering in the chat, but I think could be really interesting to get your perspective as well. So do you have any particular recommendations on the best types of text to fit jigsaws? Going back to the jigsaws you were talking about earlier.
Yes. In the examples that I showed you, the jigsaw involved different paragraphs. And it seems to me that if each paragraph talks about a different topic, it's much better than just arbitrarily chopping reading into 3 sections, so that each participant will have a certain expertise about a slightly different area. I think it's clear that not every reading is going to be ideally suited to a jigsaw, but hopefully you'll find a reading that has, say, 3 discrete ideas, and that would be ideal.
Okay, thanks. Quite a more general question now from Kenneth Nephew, who asks, what do you think's the ideal amount of time for length for a class for ESL?
Yes, and that's probably very much out of your control. I've had classes of 50 minutes. I've had 2-hour classes, 3-hour classes. Pretty much it's a given according to this class that you're assigned. But the bigger question is how you break up that class into different, and each 1-hour class, you'll have students doing different activities and so on. 3-hour classes can be ideal because you'll have so many opportunities for practice, so many opportunities for collaboration, and so on. I don't think I can say exactly what the ideal amount of class time would be.
Okay, thanks. Just had a question from Stella asking if we could show again the little recording of how to download. If people could let me know in the chat if that would be really helpful. I'm very happy to play that again for a moment. I think it's only another couple of minutes. So if you'd like us to play that again, please let us know in the chat and we'll do that. For the moment, we'll just answer another. Actually, we've had a couple of people. Dennis, are you happy for us to pause for a moment while we play that again?
We can do that. I also want to remind you that the blog will be, the webinar will be posted and people could watch that multiple times, but I'm open.
Yeah, so it'll be on the Cambridge Conversations blog and on the Very Ventures site that we're just been talking about. But I'll just play this. I'll just play this again, just for a couple of minutes.
Here is our Ventures homepage, and you will see in the top right that you have 2 options. One is sign in and one is register. If you're a new user, you'll want to register by putting in your email, creating a password. They're going to ask you some questions about your school and so on. Since I'm a frequent user, I'm just going to sign in. My computer remembers my password. And now I'm in the teacher's resource room. You'll notice in the middle that there are 60 pages worth of materials here, so it's pretty daunting. You're going to have to narrow your search, and it says refine results. If you look on the left sidebar, you can narrow your search by level, by unit, by lesson. And if you look all the way at the bottom, there are resource types including collaborative activities. So let's click on collaborative activities right now. This narrows our search, and I'm going to refine by level. I'm going to click on transitions. And you will see here that there are several titles that come up. The very first title I wanted to point out is Collaborative Activities, Transitions, Worksheets, All. In other words, this is the entire set of collaboratives for transitions, which would be a handy file to download and save. You could also select by unit. But let's actually try downloading this file right now. And there it is. And this includes collaborative activities, the ones that I just talked about in this webinar. And this will be a valuable resource for you to have. And you can right-click and save this file, and then, of course, print it as you need it.
Okay, so I hope that that helped everybody. I've got a question now from Olga Vichenko, who asks, how long do you think should be allowed for collaborative activities in class? Do you have any particular recommendations?
Well, this is another question that's not easy to answer because the teacher is going to monitor the collaborative activity, and I think it's possible that collaborative activities go too long. It has to be a sense of direction, and the teacher can often tell when the energy is waning, but typically these activities last for 10 or 15 minutes or so, but they can be shorter or they can be longer. But you'll want to make sure that your students are engaged and on task and not falling by the wayside.
Okay, thanks. Had a couple of questions about if you needed to adjust these exercises at all for maybe more advanced students. Any suggestions on how you would go about that, or maybe just sort of stronger students within this age group even? How would you differentiate?
Obviously, the materials are going to be pegged to your class level, and you'll need to monitor the level of difficulty, but any one of these tasks can be made more difficult or easier actually for lower level students. Sometimes if you have very, very advanced students, they can be classroom monitors or helpers or resource people helping those that are struggling a little more.
Okay, thanks. Question now from Christina Vanko, who asks about collaborative warmer activities, short ones to just start the class off. Do you have any suggestions for those, or are there some of these on the Ventures site?
Well, I like that question because if you're thinking about collaboration, you can bring in collaborative activities at just about any point in the lesson. Even as students are gathering for the day, sometimes I put a question on the blackboard. Remember that grammar point we learned yesterday about the present continuous tense? Turn to your neighbor and explain all the ways that we use present continuous tense. You know, just the simplest thing. Or so many exercises in the book have comprehension questions. Let students work on those questions with partners and so on. So there are many little ways in the course of a class that you can use collaboration.
Okay, thanks. To bring a couple of questions into one now, if that's okay. So, question about strategies for preventing students switching to using their L1 whilst working in groups and pairs. And I think that ties in possibly also with motivation, about students who either don't want to take part in collaborative activities or they switch to L1. How do you deal with that?
This is always an important question, and I have had to deal with that in my own teaching. I had students, and I won't tell you from what country they came in San Francisco, but they resisted collaboration because they were not used to it. They didn't think it was worthwhile, and it was a real struggle for me. And finally, I realized that I had to convince them. I couldn't trick them into doing these activities. I had to tell them and explain to them why they were important. And we went over this almost every day for a while. And we talked about how in the world you have to collaborate in the workplace, in school, and so on. And in a place especially like San Francisco, you have to speak to people with many different ways of pronouncing English, many different English abilities, and eventually they came around to realizing that I had a point, that they needed to learn to communicate with various people, and actually they became some of the biggest supporters of collaboration in the end. But in other words, reason with them, tell them why it's important to use English and not their first language. And don't give up, but just keep going over and over. Eventually, they'll get it.
Okay, well, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. So I'd just like to finish off by reminding everyone that the recording of today's webinar will be available on the Cambridge Conversations blog, on our YouTube channel, and also on the, most importantly, on the Cambridge Ventures site. You can see the URL for that on the screen at the moment. And I'd also like to let you know that we'll be back for another webinar on Tuesday, 2 hours earlier than today, when Kay Bentley will be joining us to show some exciting ways of using video with young learners. You will be getting a certificate of attendance for today's webinar. We'll send that out to you next week. That will arrive with, there'll be a link to a PDF. When you download that, you need to type in your own name where it says name of attendee. Then you've got your own personalized certificate. So, just like to finish off by saying thank you to everyone for attending. Thank you to my excellent co-moderators, John Brzezinski, Mary Louise Byers, and Sarah Mortimer, who's also been live tweeting. And thanks most of all to Dennis for sharing his expertise and wisdom on teaching. So thank you very much, Dennis.
Thank you, Alistair, and thank you, everybody, for watching. It's been a real honor to be with you today.
Okay, thanks very much, everybody. Bye.
Bye.